So now let's look at some of the combat units and information markers that are available to you as part of the components. First, let me point out something that I failed to point out last week when we were talking about the vassal module. I did mention that we had Carthaginian, Roman, and minor powers, as well as the regular markers. What I failed to mention was that each one of these tabs has a pull-down menu which gives you availability to even further types of information markers and combat units. So just be aware that if you're setting up a game, or if you're in the middle of a game, you're looking for a particular marker, that there are those pull down menus, and that's where something might be that you're looking for. So first, let's look at the Roman combat units. Let's bring out this legionary infantry. I'm going to zoom in on them. And there he is. I'm going to bring him over. So, our legionary infantry, the first thing that you'll notice about these counters is that they are very simple. They've been genericized, which I think really adds to the playability of the game. I'm certain that in some senses it would be nice if they were all identified as 1st Legion, 5th Legion. Makes it a little bit more attractive sometimes that way. But for this game, it's really not necessary. And I think it works really well, especially when you're using the off-board displays here, which can be used to store some of the stacks so that the board doesn't get too cluttered up. And you can certainly move the pieces around a lot easier. So let's take a quick look at this legionary infantry, what is on the front of his counter, and that's going to pretty much be the standard for all of the combat units within the game. So once you understand this legionary infantry, it'll be real easy for you to understand them all, at least in terms of the basic combat units. The leaders are a little bit more complicated. So obviously there's a picture on here that identifies what a legionary infantry might look like, and the text that identifies as well that he's a legionary infantry. So it keeps it real simple, so you don't have to wonder who these guys are. And it has a strength point value, which in the vassal module you can increase or decrease as you need to, which is really convenient compared to the physical module, physical game, in which you would have to be swapping out cardboard chits to get the right numerical value on the front of the counter piece. So Vassal is really well designed here in that standpoint, and I really like the way that it does it. It makes it a whole lot easier to manage from a counter standpoint. So I'm going to bring these guys out one by one so you can take a look at them. Legionary Cavalry, Gallic Infantry, Italian Infantry, these are their allies obviously, Sicilian Infantry, and then even more generically we've got the siege engines here, which do not even have a numerical value, a strength point value on them, but they represent all the types of siege engine equipment that would be available to the Romans for this particular time period. Let me delete these guys, get them out of the way. Next, let's look at the Carthaginians. Everybody's favorite, African elephants, kind of a staple of warfare from this time period. African infantry, Iberian cavalry, Iberian infantry, Ligurian infantry, Mamertine cavalry and infantry, Numidian cavalry, and then we have this guy who is an elite cavalry unit. So besides the strength point value, you're also going to have their capability boosted if they are a elite combat unit. And then of course the Carthaginians have their generic siege engine counter as well. Next, let's look at the minor powers. If you remember, this first volume takes us from the birth of the Roman Republic, pretty much from the end of the time that they broke away from monarchy rule. And so they had various enemies that they had to face, to include the Epirotes, the Samnites, the Gauls, and they were still trying to establish their dominance over the Greeks. Okay, no particular order there. And the Samnites were their primary enemy early on. And of course, there's scenarios for the Samnite War. And the Syracusans. Always a player for all of the wars of this time period. The Tarentines. So there we go. As I said, once you get the face value understanding of one, you understand them all. They're very genericized, very simple to understand. And so next, let's look at some of the markers. Got Navy markers, superiority markers, augury markers. Augury plays a big part in this game. It allows some randomness. It's basically the randomizer in the game. So each round you're going to be pulling chits out, and as these augury markers pop up, you're going to get these things like drought in Sicily, severe drought in Italy, good weather in Italy. So you're going to have some things that pop up that are some oddities that are going to add some spice to your game. You're certainly going to appreciate that aspect of it. Diplomatic markers, which show some of the diplomatic efforts for the different locations within the game, and showing when provinces, cities are in revolt, when they're being sacked. So there's lots of good components in the game. I think that they're very well done in terms of a good balance between providing information and expediting what can be a very intense, in-depth game. So next we want to take a look at the makeup of the Roman legions, at least in terms of how the game handles them. I think it's really important early on they put the section in here about the Roman legions so you can kind of understand what we're talking about. The first thing you need to know is there's some terminology here that is specifically designated for gameplay, and there's some terminology that obviously comes from historical terms such as legions and infantry and cavalry, double legions. So it can be somewhat daunting, to go back to that term that we used last week, to try to figure out how to do the setup in this game. Now, as we mentioned, the Vassal module actually does the pre-setup for you, but it's still nice to be able to know for yourself, especially if you have the board game, the physical game, how to set these armies up. And it's not necessarily logical when you start reading the setup instructions. I remember the first time I tried to set them up, I tried to pull what little hair I have left out trying to figure this thing out because it just wasn't making sense to me. And partially it was because I didn't understand what terms were game terms and what terms were historical terms. So it helped me to look at it this way. We're going to look real quick at the stack in Rome. So the first term I'm going to introduce you to here from the book, from the rule book, is force. Let me read the definition of what they're calling a force. A force is any stack of friendly combat units in one hex. So this that I'm circling the mouse cursor around is a force. But as we click on it, we can see there's lots of individual components to the stack. So what does it mean to be a force? Well, we've got some individual combat units. We've got this Urban Legion AL, Urban Legion RL, and then we've got Consular Army 1, and then we've got the Rome sticker, or Rome counter there. So let me break this down a little bit. I'm going to start by looking at our leader there, Livinus. So I'm going to bring him out, and I'm going to put this restacked. So he is the Roman consul of Rome, and if we bring back up our scenario setup, and it's going to disappear every time I click on the map, so I'll have to bring it back up. But if you look at the setup here, it's identified that P. Valerius Livinus, who is consul ID number 201, and that's that number there. We'll go over the specifics of the leader counters later. But that lets me know that I've got the right guy, because a lot of these guys share similar last names. So he goes into hex number 3714, so there's 3715. Let me hide the counters for a second. 3713, 14, and 15. So it's really easy because obviously we know we're building for Rome here, but just to show you how that works. So 3714, P. Liverius goes into Rome as the Rome consul. He is assigned the Consular Army number 1. So Consular Army is a game term. It's not a historical term per se. And so what I mean by that is if you look on this off-board display that the game provides you, this is just a way so this stack doesn't reach 5, 6, 7 inches tall at times. His units, there's the term Consular 1, which stands for Consular Army 1, shows that as the setup instructions say, he's assigned the 1st and 5th legions. So there they are, the 1st and the 5th. Now you'll notice that there are 2 legions here called the 1st and 2 called the 5th. That's because at this time period the legions were actually called double legions, and each double legion consisted of a Roman legion and an allied legion, thus the RL and the AL. And each Roman legion and allied legion would further consist of infantry and cavalry units, here consisting of 9 strength points of infantry and 1 of cavalry, whereas the allied legion would contain 9 strength points of infantry and 3 strength points of cavalry. And we'll see that mirrored here for the 5th as well. So this is just the marker identifying that he's the Roman consul, or consul of Rome. It's probably a more specific way to identify him. So again, this is all about counter management, component management during the game. So if you remember that Consular 1 is a game term and it's going to show you in the setup rules where that consular army is set up and who it belongs to. Then that's going to help you remember when you get to the game and you see there on the second counter from the right the one consular army. That tells you to go off board and you'll find the actual pieces. You could, if you wanted to, actually take those pieces and place them on the board, but I think you'd find real quick that it becomes unmanageable from a stacking standpoint. Now, additionally, notice that we also have the Urban Legion, which is basically the garrison of Rome. That's the legions that are set up for the defense of the city of Rome itself. And again, there are there is a double legion there of the Roman Urban Legion and the Allied Urban Legion. So hopefully that makes sense now. Again, the terminologies are: a force is everything that's involved in one stack. A consular army is assigned to a consul, and the consul, or rather his consular army, can consist of multiple legions, and of those legions they will be double legions, so there will be two individual legions, a Roman legion and an Allied legion, which is furthermore consisting of Roman infantry and cavalry or their associated pieces. Next, let's look real quick at the leader counter for Livinus. Working up here from the consul ID that we mentioned before, which identifies specifically which counter we're looking for. Down below it is the leader's mortality rating, his battle letter, and there can be a subordinate battle rating next to it, his campaign rating, his initiative rating, his diplomacy rating, his guile points, and of course his name. Real quick, want to look at the informational markers. Again, for instance, bringing down in revolt. So you just bring those down as needed in the game and placed on whichever hex, stack, or counter that they belong to. Charts and tables, as I mentioned, the player aid charts are not available in the Vassal module. If you have the physical game, then of course you have access to those. I do want to mention that the charts, the player aid charts, are available on the GMT website, so obviously they don't mind those being out there. I'm not sure how they feel about combining what they offer available on the website versus what's available on the Vassal module, but they do have it all available out there, and as far as I know, that's all the components for the game. So feel free to go there and look and see what is in the player aid charts. But obviously that's going to be your tables that you're going to refer to whenever you need to do combat resolution, or when you're trying to determine attrition, all of the political resolution that needs to go on. Your player aid charts are going to provide the specific tables that you need to go to, and I will be referring to some of those more in detail as we go along, but we're not at those sections yet. And then the final thing that I want to mention here is going to be the game scale. Just to kind of give you some relativity to the map. So each hex represents 13 miles from side to side, which is about the distance that one of these units that's part of the game will be able to travel in one day. So that's it for this week. Next time we'll be talking specifically about the sequence of play, which should be a lot more interesting, I think. I think we like looking at the components, the counters, but it can get somewhat repetitive as we go through this. So the sequence of play will actually start to get us into some of the motion of the game, moving us forward to how we understand how the game is played and won. So until then, I will see you next time. So long.